have all of that going on. And I'm going to shut off my telephone because it keeps ringing. Perfect. Okay, it is 1:01 on Friday, July 31st, 2020, and we are in the midst of a pandemic that is front of mind. We are also at this moment mourning the passing of John Lewis, who's a congressman, but really made his mark on the world as an activist and organizer. And we are also dealing with quite a bit of disinformation around mail-in ballots. So with all of that context, my name is Joan Donovan, and I'm the research director at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. And we are engaged in all different kinds of research at the Shorenstein Center, but the project that I lead is the Technology and Social Change Research Project. And with that project, we're looking very closely at media manipulation and disinformation campaigns. But the broad scope of the research that we really are endeavoring to do has to do with the ways in which technology and society interact and what kinds of trouble that causes. Both, as John Lewis would say, good trouble, and what we're going to talk about today, which is really bad trouble when it comes to thinking through the consequences of facial recognition technology. And I'll spare you me going on a tear for the next hour about how you don't get a technology like facial recognition without the theft of troves and troves and troves of data. But hopefully our participants today can help us move through some of these issues, and hopefully our audience will be contributing either through the Q&A panel here or in the I think it's just the Q&A panel in this one. We are very, very fortunate to have WGBH live streaming this through their YouTube channel and the Forum Network. And I'm going to introduce our panelists, but I want to prep them so that they can have things in their mind right now around, I'm going to come to you with a question sort of around, what are the stakes of the work that you're doing? What are the stakes of facial recognition technology in this moment, especially as people are online more and more, recorded more and more, interfacing with digital technologies at rates that we just have never seen in human history. We are incredibly lucky to have Ben Ewan-Campen, who's a city councilor in Somerville, my former hometown. He's also a biologist at Harvard Medical School. But as a city councilor, Ben has gained a groundswell of support campaigning on a platform rooted in creating affordable living options in Somerville, pledging to offset taxes and create jobs and to preserve green space and to improve infrastructure. Most notably in June, Ben led the campaign against facial recognition technology in Somerville and was the first East Coast city to ban its use. So I was very proud that I was living in a city that thought this was an important moment to set a precedent. Emily Dreyfus is our senior editor and new to the team at the Technology and Social Change Research Project here at Shorenstein. And she comes to us with a prolific list of bona fides, including being the former editorial director at Protocol and senior writer at Wired. And her focus for the last decade plus has been on technology and society. And so we are very lucky to have someone with her knowledge on our team guiding us through this moment and helping us get some of our writing into tip-top shape. And then last but not least, Chris Gilliard is a professor of English at Macomb County College, and his scholarship concentrates on privacy, institutional tech policy, digital redlining, and the reinventions of discriminatory practices through data mining and algorithmic decision-making. Chris is someone that over the years I have sought the counsel of every moment, I think, holy, this can't be happening. And he will be able to dig up a source very quickly and remind me that it is really happening. And so we are very, very lucky to have him on the call, and also as someone who's really a thought leader in this field. So let's kick it off. Ben, let's start with you. What's up with facial recognition technology in the line of work that you're doing? What should we be paying attention to in this moment? We'll get into some of the minutia and the technical details later about why it's so scary and why we should care. But what's front of mind for you in this moment?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. Whenever I talk about facial recognition, I always like to start by zooming out and asking people, imagine if we were to propose a new law that said, from now on, every time you leave your house, you have to wear a digital barcode on your chest. And anytime you're in public, going to the grocery store, going to the doctor's office, walking to school, the government is tracking your movement through that barcode. And that is stored in a database, and you have no idea who has access to that database, how it's regulated, what it's being used for. Also, the technology that we use is racially biased and gender biased, so it's going to be less accurate for people of certain backgrounds. Do we think that would be a popular new law? And obviously, the answer is no. But in fact, I think it's important for folks to recognize that is the world we live in. That is facial recognition, and honestly, that is a lot of other surveillance technologies too. And we've gotten used to a society where law enforcement and other government agencies make the decision for us to enact policies like this with no transparency, literally no regulations, and no democratic oversight. So in the case of Somerville, where I'm, as you mentioned, a city councilor, this is an issue that is important, I think, because a lot of folks who live here actually work in the field, and we're quite aware and we're quite scared of where this technology was headed, and knew how far ahead of the government this technology was. So we are working together with the ACLU of Massachusetts and a number of community groups, wrote a very short and straightforward law which says the government of Somerville cannot use facial recognition, period. We have since, a number of cities in Massachusetts and around the country have taken similar steps. But I think it's important to note that we are at this point playing whack-a-mole in municipalities around the state and around the country. And what was desperately needed is action at the state and federal level.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to mark too that this is really about banning particular groups that are already, like the police, that are already have enormous power to surveil folks from having a new tool in the toolkit, especially when the tool has some incredibly obvious flaws. And we will talk a bit about how technology companies have sought to fix those flaws rather in a way that would really be detrimental to society. Chris, I'd love to go to you next to talk a bit about, in your world, what are the stakes of facial recognition, given the fact that as a scholar, we're often taught not to say too much about what the outcomes should be, but rather to mark empirically what is going on. But your research and your position on this is often a guidepost for many who are trying to understand what the stakes are. So love to hear from you about where you're at in this moment.
So, I mean, without being hyperbolic, I think the stakes are democracy. I think, we don't have to look very far. We can look at the protests going on now that have been going on for the past several weeks and months, where government is flying surveillance planes over protests, using facial recognition, tracking people down by the T-shirt they bought, and things like that. And the two of the people I think about or refer to are Woody Hartzog and Evan Selinger, who talk about the value of obscurity in a society, so the ability to go about your business without everybody knowing what your business is. And I think that is such an essential bedrock element of our a sort of rights-based society, of a democratic society, that we can't do without. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that democracy itself is kind of at stake.
And that gets back to and ties into some of the things that I think, have come up in the research and in the writing that you've done around, it's not just privacy, right? The question isn't, about your private data, but also about what others are permitted to know about you without you ever even knowing that they're siphoning this data, that they're collecting it, they're collating it, they're aggregating it. And those are generally practices of the administrative state, right? That's where surveys and, the even the census in some ways, right? Those kind of practices of capturing and cataloging folks, we start to see those start to trickle into all kinds of business models, and in particular around the innovation of this technology itself. So I don't think you're being hyperbolic when you say that the stakes are quite high when it comes to being able to exercise your rights. Emily, from the work that you've been doing in the journalism over the last, decade or so, what's the long tail here? What should be, where, has facial recognition shown up in different contexts of your reporting, and how should we think about a new technology that is really black boxed? It's not easy for us to know how this works. And of course, we're indebted to the Gender Shades Project and Joy Balawini, as well as her colleagues that have really been able to put on the map that this technology doesn't work the way that companies say it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any reporters and editors and journalists who have been working around technology issues, and specifically about facial recognition technology, will say that the issue of facial recognition is kind of the perfect example of why we actually need regulation on this kind of technology, because what we have without, in the vacuum of regulation that Ben described, what we have is technologists who we are depending on to make the right choice to protect us from their own products. And as Chris was talking about, people go around in their daily lives and they upload images, and they need freedom, and they want to be able to take a video of police brutality, and those things should be empowering to them. Those are social behaviors that these technology companies that I've been reporting on, that we all research, have encouraged us to do as part of our normal daily part of our lives. But in the background, what we have is this system that is gathering those images, gathering those videos unbeknownst to us, without our consent, and that is not top of mind for us, and around which there are no guardrails. And so what we have in the moment is actually that we're at the mercy of the technologists themselves to be ethical, or make the right decision, or to be forward thinking and say, like, how is my technology going to be abused? And in some instances with facial recognition, we've seen that, like, years ago, Google had said something along the lines of, like, we will not build, though we could, an algorithm that will scrape all of the social images from the web and be a facial recognition panopticon tool. And it was like, oh, great, thanks, Google, for not doing that. But then, as we have seen from the important reporting of journalists this year, other technologists created the company Clearview AI, which then did exactly that. And what we have learned is it wasn't illegal. And that is because there are not laws about it at all. And as journalists, I mean, the hardest part is that there's not even laws around transparency. So it's hard for us to even know what's happening. It's hard for us to know where to begin. It's a painstaking process of FOIA-ing and getting the government to tell us anything about which police departments are using what, and what kind of contracts do they have. And it is a game of whack-a-mole for journalists as well. But I do think that that Chris, I totally agree with you when you say democracy is at stake, because one of the most important foundations of democracy is information, so that anyone can even know what's going on. And that's what I think journalists are trying to deal with.
So let's discuss a bit about the technology itself, because when we say facial recognition, we could mean a lot of things. But I think, one of the most simple examples is you log into Facebook, you upload a new picture, it's you and 4 friends, maybe you're hanging out at a lake, enjoying yourselves, maybe, you're having a good time, and it auto tags folks. It sees them and says, oh, this is Sally, this is Tom, and, this is Jason. And you just say, yes, 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 right? You just agree to all of these things. And immediately it has then, sorted them and then automated the process by which it has collected the data and represented it to you. And, a lot of people are, see that happen on Instagram and things, think, this is great. Like, now I don't have to tag all my friends. That's sort of the innocent use case scenario in which we could understand facial recognition technology coming to pass. But why don't we talk a little bit about some of those other use cases and try to unpack a bit what it is that the technology is doing. Let me take a volunteer. I don't want to call on anyone, but if you have an idea of, this is really, this example is indicative of a situation in which, facial recognition technology works this one way. And once we know how it works, we have all of these other collateral damage to society. Ben, did you want to take it?
Sure. I mean, I'd like to just address it from the perspective of government use, which is kind of what I'm particularly interested in. I think 2 ways that facial recognition is often discussed in the context of criminal investigations. You have, say there's a photograph of a suspect in a crime. Facial recognition, in this example, law enforcement could run that against a database of faces and identify a suspect. It's sort of a souped up version of the old fashioned, put a photo on the cover of a newspaper and ask the public, who is this person? Then, of course, at the other end of the extreme, you have cameras are pointed at a crowd in public, and every single member of that crowd is identified in real time as they move through space. From my point of view, advocates of using facial recognition for law enforcement focus on that first example, which I think many people believe is less offensive to the public and is just, it's sort of we're just identifying a suspect of a potentially really, really dangerous situation. There's someone on the loose who we need to identify immediately. Surely you trust us to do that. And I think what's incredibly important for the public to understand is there is absolutely no legal distinction between those 2 uses. At this point, I really want to emphasize, we're not exaggerating when we say there are no laws around this. There is no laws about how these technologies are used, who has access to the data, what the data is, how the data can be used in a court. I mean, it's really, really, really unregulated. And so I think it's important that folks understand that the worst possible use case you can imagine, an authoritarian government that is tracing people out of just outright vindictive spite to take away life and liberty, is within the same legal framework of we're identifying a dangerous person running through a mall with a gun.
And I think that, Ben, what you're bringing up here reminds me of some research that was done by the Georgetown Privacy and Law Clinic around DMV photos being used in facial recognition databases. So what's great about a DMV photo is they're all standard, right? And so you show up, the camera, and all the measurements are the same. And that actually gives you a very clear facial imprint to be able to, pull closed circuit TV data or an image from a crowd and match it up against. But nobody is taking a picture in the perpetual, in the DMV thinks they'll be in this, this perpetual lineup, as Georgetown has called it, right? And so that to me is is really, you know, when we think about it in terms of facial recognition, we automatically start to slide over to think about social media data. But then there's all these unintended uses of people's data that have proliferated that governments haven't thought, you know, state governments haven't really thought was problematic. But we have to be very careful when we start to assume, you know, the right kind of attitude, right? That would say, oh, well, they're obviously, you know, benefit of the doubt here, searching for someone that is a danger to themselves and others. When at the same time, that system building, the work they do to build these systems in between searching for suspects, of course, is a massive undertaking, and you know, millions of dollars is spent in the process. Emily?
Yeah, I wanted to say, kind of picking up on what both of you were saying, you know, Ben, the example you give of, you know, police looking for a specific suspect and running images through a system as opposed to a camera in the sky kind of gathering everyone, those sound like really different examples, but actually they're super related. And because of what Joan is talking about in terms of the images and technology gathering that goes into building the algorithms that could even be the facial recognition system that recognizes a lineup, involves data from so many different sources. And I mean, one of the most famous sources is that a professor in Colorado at a college put a camera on the campus and he gathered images of thousands of students coming and going. And those images were then put into this training set that I think is it's called like the unclassified college student set. And that set is now in tons of different facial recognition algorithms. That is the training data that allows the systems to learn what faces look like. And so there's problems of consent all the way up the building of these systems. And then there's this real tension in terms of you actually need more images to make the systems accurate, which then involves probably invading even more privacy. And to go back to the original example of just Facebook, you know, saying, do you want to tag this person? That seems like a benign thing, but actually, if you have your settings set to have that image be public, and you tag someone who may not be able to control whether you tag them or not, you yourself are taking consent away from your friend to now have a public image tagged with their name in Facebook. And then what we know is that we have to then look at what are the agreements Facebook has with researchers or third parties or governments to actually then use that information and bring it all into these data pipes that then become the facial recognition systems. And Joan, you're talking about the DMV images. And I mean, one thing about the DMV images, right, is that because they're so standardized, they're not actually that helpful in terms of identifying people who are maybe out in the world and who are like obscured in some way in the camera or have their hood up. They kind of only help if you're getting the image that looks like the DMV image. And there's some irony in the fact that some of the like big data problems that technologists think are kind of like sexy problems of like, how do we just make the tech better? Or how can we make these streams of information all talk better? Some of the ways in which the big data doesn't communicate or has limits is actually the very thing in the vacuum of legislation that is protecting people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And can I add to this? So
you can add all day long, Chris. I'm waiting
so
on
one
it.
of the lies, I mean, I'll just call it what it is, lies that public officials and technologists will tell is that this stuff makes us safer. Yeah. There's absolutely no evidence of that. You know, I mean, they'll throw out like a child in danger or some kind of terrorist situation. I mean, barring what we might not know because of national security, but other than that, there's no evidence that this stuff makes people safer. I mean, it sounds like it's supposed to or something, or people tell that story all the time. And so it becomes sort of accepted. But there's very little research that bears that out. And I just wanted to point to also add to what Emily was talking about the example in Colorado. So that public database, so those images wound up all over the world and used for a variety of things, including by military companies or companies that make military technology. So it's not, again, not hyperbolic to say that a student was walking on campus and their face wound up being helped to, target drones or discriminate against Uyghurs. Like, so, yeah, that is, I mean, I can't really articulate how horrible that is. But if people want more information on that, the Adam Harvey's Megapixels project did a kind of deep dive into that.
So let's talk a bit, since it seems to be an important part of the conversation, which is, how do we know what we know about how people end up in these databases? Really is a lot of the work journalists have been putting into uncovering what's inside these databases and how the ways in which the technology is cast as this, future-proof, making us safer, better for all, is cast against the fact that it tends to misgender folks, as well as depending on people's skin tones. And there's a lot of research, and I'll probably kick it over to Chris first to talk a bit about the research around how racial bias shows up in photography in general. And so, in this moment, as we're trying to think about like how these databases are crafted, right? What goes into the ingredient list? A lot of people love to describe algorithms as being like recipes for things. I've done it myself. But in order to make facial recognition viable, you do have to craft very particular data sets, some of young people, some of older folks, and then you have to have a sort of panoply of racial categories and racialized databases in order to do some of the identification work that the technology purports to do. But Chris, do you want to talk a bit about technology and race, especially that history of photography that is at the core of efforts by companies to diversify data sets? Heavy air quotes on diversify.
Just piggybacking on what you said and what Ben said, I mean, the technology, and I want to caution that I'm going to do not as great a job as someone would benefit from going to look at the Gender Shades project, but I mean, facial rec is, or face surveillance, as ACLU sometimes calls it, is notoriously inaccurate for darker skin, for Black women, for younger people. And I mean, again, so I love to point to real examples. And so there were just two, I'm based in Detroit, and there were just two in Detroit. So we have a pretty extensive network of surveillance cameras in the city. It goes under the name Project Greenlight. And there were just two examples where Black men were misidentified by the facial rec and arrested and charged based on these faulty identifications. And in one case, the only way that the man knew that it was he was being charged because of facial recognition is because the officer slipped up and said, "Oh, I guess the camera was wrong." And so as people were reporting on this, it was reported as the first two known instances where people were falsely implicated. But as Ben pointed out, because there are so few laws and so much of the stuff is able to operate sort of in the dark, and also that there's these weird carve-outs so that, for instance, law enforcement might not be able to do certain things, but then private companies are allowed to do that, and then law enforcement can buy it from a private company. And so it's just this sort of like expansive and unregulated mass or web of connections that are at risk, particularly for misidentifying and ingesting Black folks into a system that's already kind of biased against them.
Ben, did you want to add?
Yeah, I really also wanted to just add to this that whenever we're having these conversations about the possible pros and cons of a technology, the safety, the privacy, this is the general public is overwhelmingly opposed to facial recognition. This is not a close issue. The ACLU in Massachusetts did a poll. 91% of the people that they talked to said this should be paused until it's regulated. So that's bipartisan, right? This is not a close issue. The only reason that this is continuing to grow and continuing to be a widespread technology is because we have a structure set up where law enforcement and government agencies get to start doing this stuff without any public process. And I really strongly believe that if elected officials had to proactively opt in to this type of technology with a public process where the public was informed about how these technologies worked, all the issues that Chris, that Emily, that you were bringing up, these would not be popular. They're already not popular as soon as people hear about them. And the issue right now, I mean, not only are these a threat to democracy, these are happening because we have anti-democratic structures built into the way our government works. Even in a place like Massachusetts, solid blue, allegedly very progressive state, there's been a statewide ban that's stalled at the State House for, I think, over a year at this point. It's potentially a moratorium is going to be included in their criminal justice reform bill that's there now, but I mean, I'll believe it when I see it. It hasn't passed yet.
Yeah, can
Emily?
I follow up on that? Another thing that we just don't know, and that those two examples are so scary about, is just like how many police departments and officials are even using what technology. Like, we know that it's not just police, but it's also federal agencies, and that includes the FBI and also Customs and Border Protection, who use facial recognition to try to find people and deport them or enact some kind of agenda. And the thing that is so incredibly terrifying and we think is already happening is that it doesn't have to be an image of, let's say, a person committing a crime. This technology is strong enough that if you take a picture and there is someone in the background going about their life, these images can pick up that picture, and the government can then use that to deport someone or to do any number of things, and we don't really know anything about it. I encourage you guys to go and look at the reporting about Clearview AI that came out, in particular the story from Kashmir Hill, who's a reporter at the New York Times. She detailed how she figured out that this private company had created this new system and was giving it to police departments. And one of the things she discovered when she was using it, when she was reporting it, was that she would get all of these cops who were testing it for the company for free, and they were saying, this thing works incredibly. Like, there's all these cases that we, and who knows how important these cases were. I don't know what kind of crimes we're even talking about here. Where we didn't have a suspect, and then we ran it through this system and it picked up images from all over the web and it shot out suspects' names. So she asked them to run her name because there are all sorts of images of her online. And oddly, they told her it returned nothing, which she found to be suspect. And what had actually happened, she realized after speaking with a police officer who told her off the record the truth, was that when her name was run through the system flagged her name. And the private company Clearview AI then called police officers and said, why are you running a reporter's name through our system? And in that case, then threatened to remove the technology from their precinct and that say, we will not let you use our fancy facial recognition technology if you are working with the press. And so it was, there was nothing illegal about that. And it showed that in that instance, this private company had control over public law officials and was empowered to, make decisions on their behalf.
Yeah, and we just to follow up on that, we did a Big If True episode a couple weeks ago with Biella Coleman and Luke O'Brien, specifically about the relationship between these tech entrepreneurs and neo-reactionary philosophy and their ties to the so-called alt-right, which is to say that technology is an incredibly, incredibly powerful force that shapes society as it is shaped by society. And laws, too, are a really important part of that matrix of balance. And if, as Chris has pointed out, that the police don't even have to ask before using specific technologies, and that these technologies might even be gifted in a way so as to gain access and to know more about what the target market is, we do have to, in the way that we think about technology's impact on society, start to come up with pre-regulatory schemas in some ways, right? Before the technology becomes too powerful, too well integrated, becomes its own industry, there has to be thought process put into that. And it's reminding me of some early work around genetics where during the Clinton administration, there was this idea that we're getting closer and closer to mapping the genome. And they wanted to produce a law that basically made it so that if we did discover a gay gene, you couldn't use that analysis, to test an unborn baby and then potentially abort the child if there were, that you didn't want, quote unquote, a gay baby or a gay child. And, regulation like that has this kind of sci-fi feel to it, where it's like, we don't know if that's possible or if the technology can even do that, but we do need to think proactively about how to protect folks from the power of this technology. But at the same time, as some people have been asking in the chat, we're in this moment where the technologists themselves are just moving. They just keep iterating on the system. And one of the iterations I found to be particularly worrisome and troublesome was this idea that, well, if we're doing really poorly at marking racialized categories, then we just need to, quote unquote, diversify the data set and get more and more of these images. And as we start to discover this iterative process of, instead of saying, oh, there's, 91% of people think this technology is not something that we should be pursuing in mass. And then other folks are saying, yeah, we don't want law enforcement incorporating this into their databases. There still seems to be momentum and resources and money behind producing these massively large big data systems that can know specifically your identity and where you've been online, and then how that might tie into more personalized metadata. So where am I going with this? What I want to ask is, in a world where we are right now, what are the laws or the regulations we need, right? Is it we need a national moratorium on innovation in this space, or we need a national transparency initiative that says, if you're using these technologies and you're part of government, you have to somehow account for their use. I struggle to think anything less than refusal, like in the words of Nazma Ahmed, please do not include us, right? Like, the inclusion rhetoric around this technology is purposeful. What kinds of regulations, and this could be a moonshot, it could be something that maybe never it comes to fruition, but But where is the no point? Like, how do we figure out like where we stand so that we can push for those outcomes? And Ben, I'm sure you've been thinking a lot about this, so I'd love to hear from you.
So I have a very focused answer, which is I actually think that this stuff is not inevitable, and that it is absolutely possible for democratic institutions to push back against them. And very specifically, in addition to banning facial recognition in Somerville, I think actually the much more important thing that we did at the same time was a general surveillance oversight policy. And this is something that the ACLU has been pushing in municipalities and states. They call it CCOPS, or community control over policing. But the basic premise, it's a very low bar. It just says if the government wants to obtain a new surveillance technology of any kind, they need to bring that to the public, have a public hearing, and affirmatively opt into it. You can't do this by default. By no means do I think that that will result in governments don't have surveillance equipment. I think that there will be many instances where the use of, cameras at dangerous intersections, things like that, I think the government will be able to make a compelling case to the public on certain technologies. But I think that that type of really, really basic returning transparency and public oversight to the basic process of just procuring surveillance equipment for a city or a state, I think that is fundamental. I guess I think that that is an incredibly important first step for all of this, and I think it's remarkable that we've defaulted to a situation where that doesn't happen.
Chris, let me twist this just a little bit to hit on some of the stuff that you've brought my attention to, which is sure, great, yeah, transparency, surveillance, oversight. What about things like the ring, or surveillance cameras in public parks, right, that are direct pipes in many ways to police officers? One option is knowing what the police and federal forces are up to. The other piece, though, is about what we reference as the third party, right, which is the person, the sort of mythical entrance of Amazon and other corporations to this mix. What does that layer add in terms of complicating any kind of regulation that we might try to enact?
So I kind of referred to this earlier. So let's take automated license plate readers for a second. And so there are companies, say like Vigilant Solutions, which has thousands, tens of thousands of automated license plate readers posted all across the country, and including they put them on top of repo people put them on top of their vehicles as they drive around, things like that. This is a gigantic web of stuff. So I believe it's illegal, or somewhat. I mean, someone's going to cite carpenter to me, but I'm not an attorney. I believe it's illegal for, say, law enforcement to put a tracker on your car indefinitely, for instance. But through the networks like that Vigilant have, they can just go purchase that information from third parties, as you call them. And so, or something like with a ring, right? If enough people have a ring in a community, you could have a pretty accurate map, or combine that with other information, you could have a pretty accurate map of people's movements, just based on not technology that the law enforcement might have in their own hands, but the conglomeration of technologies that are available through private companies. And so if I were to talk about my moonshot, I mean, not only should things like facial recognition, face surveillance, and other biometric identifiers just be banned outright, like private and public, but also things that ingest people into the system without their consent. And I realize that's sort of a problematic model, but it's shorthand. Things that ingest people into the system without their consent also should be banned, so that that would include things like automated license plate readers, people's private surveillance cameras, you know, things like that. Because I think that the distinction between public and private is very overstated, in that since there are no laws, there are very few laws that prevent governments from acquiring these things from private companies who are basically allowed to do what they want, except for in cases like the one Ben mentioned.
Emily?
I was just going to say, yeah, I think that Ring and the apps like Nextdoor and Citizen just also speak to the kind of consumerization of surveillance and this trend of people like reporting on each other in a way, and it's encouraged by the government. And we just saw, I mean, earlier this month, ICE said that they were going to begin having training sessions that citizens could come to and learn how to officiate arrests, or, you know, work on behalf of ICE. And I think that, I mean, I don't want to be the pessimist on the panel, but I do find it hard to, how do we legislate that? I don't really, I don't know how you legislate away the instinct for people to act as agents of the state in some ways. And that's a little bit what we see with Ring, like neighborhood people saying, I mean, I guess one term that we could use actually is like being Karens. It's like the Karenization of a neighborhood, using technology that then is a, you know, as Chris was saying, like a direct line to law enforcement. I think, yeah, you could just ban it outright. That would be nice. And another thing that I think in terms of, I love the idea for opt-in. Also, we should require, if people do decide to allow these things to be used in that scenario where they've decided to actively opt in, there should then also be a real paper trail of how it was used. Because we can look back in moments where, like, Congress, let's say, after 9/11 said, okay, we're going to give the rights to do this kind of gathering of metadata. But then afterwards, we don't necessarily see how the gathering is used until many, many years later, when we realize it wasn't used the way it had been initially intended or something like that. So also in any kind of federal law, we need to have built in a paper trail, and it has to be timely and available almost immediately so that there can really be oversight.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think that, you know, if, you know, Danielle Citron or someone of her ilk were on this panel, they would also be saying yes, and, right, that we need this and we need more. And I'm thinking here too about the nascent discussions we've been having about deepfakes, and 96% of deepfakes are used to make pornography. And that's pornography of people whose images have been taken, and they are then put in these very compromising positions. So you don't make deepfake pornography, you know, in order to impress someone, right? Like, you do it because there's a monetary motivation to using a celebrity's likeness. And here, you know, as we start to think about who owns your identity and identity theft and identity fraud, you know, I'm thinking here about, you know, also the ways in which databases like this could be contorted to break other systems, like facial recognition systems that we use to open our iPhones and things of that nature, right? There's ways in which all of these things are being sorted and collated and then aggregated. I'm thinking here too about Sarah Brain over at UT Austin has a book coming out, I think soon, about big data and policing and big data. You know, she was one of the very first ethnographers to get access to LAPD during the time of their adoption of Palantir. And one of the things that her work has shown is how Palantir doesn't just take an image and a few other data points. It really takes everything it can find out about the world and the environment and then stitches it to people's identities, right? And so that could be a phone number, it can be an address, it can be a car, license plate, or DMV information, it can be social media. And in LA, there's been instances where police have pulled over grandmas who are driving their car, but the police are looking for folks that they claim are gang affiliated that have been networked through these systems. So it's not just that it puts you in relationship to your image, but also puts your image into relationship with all of these other surveillance systems. And that's why it's important that we start to think about surveillance as a mode of governance that is enhanced by technology, especially network technologies, where most of us willfully throughout the day put up our thoughts, put up our pictures, put up our, things that have been exciting. It's now very easy for folks to find out what your birth date is, what your, other aspects of your identity, or using a little bit of finesse and technology. If someone posts a picture of their house, you might be able to find that information as well, which is to say that we're enmeshed in not just a moment where facial recognition is happening and is sort of on the move, but it's part of a legacy set of technologies and information gathering systems that are big business. There's a lot of money to be had. Data is a kind of currency in this moment. And but I'm struck, Emily, and kind of stuck on this idea, and we've been discussing this in our research team, about how often people are willing to take on, especially white people, are willing to take on the functions of the state, right? Especially when it comes to policing. But to know that most people are against facial recognition technology, I wonder, though, if there are other use cases in which, if it were framed differently, rather than being framed as the government is using this, but it can help you do X, Y, and Z when it comes to sorting your social media, that they might not recognize it as one in the same system.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to get some final thoughts about innovation and these moments where we have to keep our eye on the consequences, which means we have to keep our eye on the use cases. We have to keep our eye on the folks that are using this and don't want us to know that they're using it. And so I'll kick it over to you, Emily, for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I could talk about this all day, but my final thought just on what we were talking about is, it's hard for any of us to bear in mind the huge apparatus and systems of surveillance that exist around us. And the phrase surveillance surveillance capitalism kept coming to mind as you were talking, Joan, because right now we're talking about facial recognition technology as used by the state to, prosecute people or persecute people. But actually, there's a whole apparatus of surveillance that we opt into when we use technology, and that is, underlying all of the large tech companies that just made, so much money yesterday, even after the hearing in Congress. This is the world in which we live. And I want to answer one question that someone asked in the Q&A, which was, how much, if anything, do masks help protect you against facial recognition technology? And I think that question ties into the surveillance capitalism idea, because just earlier this week or last week, Apple announced that they had an update to the face unlock that people use on their phone, that now it can recognize your face wearing a mask, since in the pandemic, everyone is wearing masks. And at first it wasn't working well. Well, the technologists worked overtime behind the scenes, and now the system can recognize you just based on the upper half of your face. And that's great from a convenience perspective if you're someone who loves that program. But it also goes to show that, now these systems can recognize protesters wearing masks who are marching for Black Lives Matter. And it just has us, I urge us all to bear in mind that these things are related. You know, when you make a technological advancement for the purpose of convenience, it can then be co-opted by the state for other purposes.
Ben?
I don't want to make it sound like I'm an optimist about this. I think, you know, I could listen to these stories all day, and it can be overwhelming. But the optimism that I do want to share is, I often get asked, what was it like to try to pass the facial recognition, the surveillance oversight in Somerville? Was there a lot of pushback? Was there a big discussion? And the simple answer is that there was not. But the reason that there was not, the reason that it was pushing on an open door, was because the year before that, we had a kind of wave election in the city council where a lot of new people, I think in the aftermath of 2016, started paying attention. People like me who don't have a background in politics ran for office, but much more importantly, voters started paying attention to this and realizing that they were not happy about a lot of the basic decisions that their local government makes. So this is at a really, really local level. And I don't want to pretend by any means that electoral politics is going to solve all these problems. But the fact that there were a lot of new people, you know, folks like me who identify as socialists, who were brought in and really wanted to take on these issues, it made it possible for us to take, you know, admittedly small steps. But I think that I don't have another great idea besides people all over the country and the world taking over your local governments, moving that upwards, taking over state governments as well, and trying to make progress, because this is the situation that we're in. And it is one of the most important challenges that we're going to be facing for decades to come. So, you know, I don't think giving up is an option, as terrifying as it is.
Yeah, and Ben, I see the work that you do certainly as one arrow in the quiver, right? That we have to try all the things to fortify ourselves against what you know. And what I'm going to take away from what you were talking about here is that this isn't determined; it's not inevitable. And you know, I've shied away from the tech speak about this kind of conversation where they're like, "Well, you know, if we don't do it, China will," and it's just like, no. That's not how any of this works. But we do get into these situations where, you know, when we're taking small steps, people often think that's not enough, but you don't get somewhere, right, without that journey. And so that part is, you know, front of mind for me. And Chris, I am going to kick it over to you to solve all the problems, as I always do.
Okay, so Emily, I'm going to push back ever so gently on the opt-in notion. It's one that kind of hurts me because, I mean, let's say there's some mythical person who exists who like was born today as like a 20-year-old and wasn't in any system. Like by the end of the day, they would be in every system, like whether or not they have sort of clicked yes. And that's
Right.
part of the problem, is that there is no meaningful way, even for someone who's highly technical, highly motivated, you know, and highly technically proficient, to stay out of the system, unless you just, I mean, even if you move to the woods, you got to drive there and you got to rent a truck and like all these other things. I mean, for instance, I tried to like make a burner phone. The number of steps you have to go through to make like a secure, like real burner phone, it's like completely unrealistic. And if you make one mistake, then you're burnt, you're toast. So, and the other thing I think is that part of the problem, and this is super pessimistic, I'm sorry, but
Don't be sorry. That's why you're here.
You said, Emily, is that until, so marginalized populations know what it's like to be surveilled, like from day one, you know, whether that's trans folks, people who are poor, Black, you know, on and on. And so I think a big part of the problem is that people who are not amongst those populations typically see the state in service to them. They never imagine that the state is coming for them or is going to persecute them, only that it's going to work for them and not against them. And to that extent, until we shift that notion, you know, so again, we could look at the protest, recent protests. So there's been uproar when white moms were attacked, or there's more uproar when, you know, an elderly white man was pushed over, you know. which is not to say that people aren't outraged by other events, right? But there seemed to be a different kind of outrage at some of those things. So until more populations understand that oppressive state power in terms of surveillance or violence isn't always going to be in their favor, some things probably won't change. I think we need to change that. And so, yeah, that's what I got.
No, I think we all probably agree on that this state, there is always this tension between, and we see it made manifest really clearly in the policing of protests right in this moment, where there's complete and total misalignment between police forces, politicians, the state and the Fed, the military even. And in those fissures, I think it's important for us to recognize that when the state isn't aligned with the same kinds of policing and surveillance strategies, those two are political opportunities to push and to show exactly what's at stake and exactly what kinds of abuses of technology are happening or being carried out in ways that aren't necessarily ways that we're supposed to find out about and that we're supposed to know about. And so the work of journalists to uncover that, and politicians like our city councilman like Ben to help us understand that and to get into deeper into understanding the machina behind local policing, I think is important. But in the broad scope, Chris, I take what you say as true always, which is to be extremely skeptical of when politicians or the police or technologists step into the fray as if they have all of the answers, and that there are no contradictions, right? Because I think that the contradictions are what's the contradictions, if we don't confront them, are exactly the ways in which the status quo gets carried on, and that technologies like this can get scaled rather rapidly if nobody pushes back for even when the stakes seem to be not necessarily theirs to gain. And so I want to thank everybody for a really robust conversation here, and to encourage you all to sign up for our newsletter, Me More Weekly, and to follow the scholarship of Chris and the work of Ben and Emily. And I'm also happy to field any questions that people have offline if you want to send us an email at manipulation@hks.harvard.edu. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. If we had an audience, everybody would be like clapping. And good luck. Have a great weekend. It's very good to see you all.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.